Is Islam scripture and text and the interpretation of scripture and text alone? Or is it more than that? Having a dome on top of a building and a high minaret. None of these things I've mentioned is in scripture. Nor in the Quran, nor in the Hadith. Every single participant of the research expressed that in some point in their lives they were on the brink of suicide.
Why should we be concerned with this community at all?
One of the participants in his mid-20s, he said he visits dating apps for homosexuals. He said on that dating app, he said, I've seen 50, 60-year-old men from my mosque who I know who stand in the first line of prayer and who are married and have kids. We see people as a sin or as a good deed, as a as piety. Or as sinfulness, as virtue or vice. These are human beings. We need to humanize people as opposed to looking at people as good deeds and bad deeds.
Traditional Muslim values are being eroded, and that's why we're even opening a conversation about this at all.
But it's within our community. We've hidden it. We've shied away from it. If someone asked us not to be heterosexual,
that would be quite challenging. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, and I'm very honored to welcome our guest today, Dr Muhammed Reza Tajri, to talk about quite a sensitive topic. But before we get into any of the details of that, my first question is to ask you about your academic background and how you got into the topic of sociology. What was your pathway? Because usually Hawza students, we go into fiqh or philosophy or theology. So what has brought you to where you are today?
Thank you so much for having me on to talk about this. So first, as you know, we were together back 20 years ago, we're talking about now. And we went to Syria together, Arabic, came back to the UK, done our masters. And as you mentioned, from then, the normal Islamic disciplines that Hawza students would go into is fiqh or philosophy, and those topics didn't really interest me at all. So it's a kind of interest pull as well as circumstances pulled me in a certain way as well. And I ended up doing a master's in Cardiff University, which was really sociologically based. Actually, I wanted to get my hands on the Muslim community and how they were acting, why they were acting, as opposed to reading about classical books on philosophy. That really didn't appeal to me. I found it boring, or maybe I just wasn't intelligent enough for it to grasp those topics anyway. So I went down the the sociological route. And so my master's in Cardiff was based on that. And then the PhD thereafter was also heavily sociology based rather than philosophy or anything else.
So what is sociology? And, what kind of useful information does it give us?
That question is probably really apt. Because of what we're talking about. It really frames the discussion really well. Sociology or Islamic sociology, which is not so accurate. Let's say sociology of Muslims, not Islamic sociology. Sociology of Muslims really looks at social behaviors, how practices, institutions, how they structure and shape the behavior of the communities you're talking about. It's the application really of some sociological theories to the Muslim societies and whether they fit or whether they're going against it. And there is a criticism of it when you're looking at Muslim societies saying that sociological theories are emanating from the West. So this is kind of colonial imposition on Muslim society. It doesn't really fit. That's fine. You can have Islamic sociology and have newer sociological theories of why and how Muslims are behaving in a certain Muslim societies are behaving in a certain way. So under this wider umbrella, you could have themes of identity, how Muslims are looking at themselves in a modern world, where they're looking at a classical tradition they've brought along with them and how they're shaping that and practicing that, performing that, living that in the modern world. You could look at how, for example, Muslims are behaving in areas of social activism and social justice, how they are bringing the Islamic tradition to play their part in that. Family dynamics, gender roles, Of course, we could talk about these same topics with all societies
Yeah.
and every different society, but with the sociology of Muslims, you're looking at a particular segment. Why? Because, of course, as opposed to any other segment of people, they're going to have a shared tradition,
Yeah.
which is informing these beliefs and practices. And of course, we have to ask ourselves the wider question: what is Islam?
Yeah.
And you mentioned about the Hawza students. Yeah, they normally go down the fiqh route or philosophy route or even mysticism, for example. When we think about Islam, we have to realize that we're going to ask ourselves, really, is Islam scripture and text and the interpretation of scripture and text alone? Or is it more than that? Actually, Islam is a lived and experienced tradition that we live and experience on a daily basis, you and I.
Yeah.
It's not all fiqh books and books of classical philosophy.
Yeah.
It's how we live and how we translate the tradition we have into practice. So we know the late Princeton scholar Shahab Ahmed, of course, asks in his book, what is Islam? If we say it's a lived tradition, if we say it's what Muslims do, can we simply say that it's everything Muslims do is Islam? Of course, he goes back on that and it's not that at all. But when we're looking at Muslims per se, and we think of Islam as scripture and books alone, we're forgetting the fact that the way, for example, how and why Shia Muslims perform the latam or ma'tam, it is the how and why of the whirl of the dervishes when they spin around. It is the architectural, economic, cultural reasons behind having a dome on top of a building and a high minaret. None of these things I've mentioned is in scripture, nor in the Quran, nor in the Hadith. It's all Islam. It's all Islam. It's become iconified really in Islamic tradition. So how all of those scriptures, beliefs, creed, ideologies we've brought down with us are affecting the way we live today, what's important to us today in a religious sense, although all of these things I've mentioned have nothing to do with scripture at all, how we've translated that to live Islam today. But also we have to remember the importance of looking at societies. We have to also realize and admit to ourselves that not only is the scripture informing the way we act, not only are the laws informing the way we carry them out and apply them today in societies, but it has also worked the other way around. Over the centuries, how societies behave has formed scripture. We know when the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, came with the message of Islam and laws, the laws as we call them imda'i, means they really encompassed the society at the time. They were based on how people were already acting, not only civil law and transactions and marriages and buying and selling, even the way people began to worship, the formal acts of worship, prayer, fasting, hajj, was based around what people already appreciated, how the pagans were already acting. So, and of course, beyond that, as we come down the centuries, we have, as we know in Usul al-Fiqh, for example, the principle of Sirat al-Uqala. What does it mean? It means how the rational or sensible people have been behaving. And it's seen as the conventional thing to do and that the right thing to do then. And that forms law. Not necessarily because Allah decreed that this is what you should do, but people behave in this way and that's the conventionally right way to act. So you can see social behaviors impact what we traditionally have defined as Islam narrowly. And that narrow understanding of Islam, text and scripture, has and keeps informing the society as well. So sociological engagement, sociological investigation is really, really important to see how that dynamic is taking place. So when we look at sociology, the strands of sociology or sociological methods of research, really we can look at two main strands when we're trying to investigate things. One we say is quantitative, means that you're looking at numbers. How many Muslims really believe X, Y, and Z? How many Muslims have migrated from here to there? How many Muslims feel or think of themselves in a certain way? How many Muslims believe a certain thing? How are trends shifting in terms of numbers? Or we can look at qualitative, means now we're looking at deep narratives of how people are expressing themselves, how they are identifying themselves, how they live, how they perform. Let's sit and observe them and see why they're acting in a certain way. So it's less to do with numbers and more to do with the real substance of what's happening in a certain environment. So, and the topic we're talking about today really hinges on the second of those methods, looking at how and why and the deep experiences of a certain segment of Muslims.
Yeah, I think what I really picked out of that is that the sociology is to do with the lived tradition.
The lived tradition. The lived tradition is a nice term that's cropped up in sociology a lot. Islam, again, we've spoken about books and scriptures, but how are those things lived?
Yeah, how they translated. And it kind of gives you like a snapshot of where Muslims are, with the theory all on one side, how they're actually using that theory to navigate their personal lives, to navigate their communities. And like you said as well, how there is this kind of symbiotic relationship where the tradition informs practice, but then vice versa, the way it's practiced actually reinforms.
Absolutely, absolutely
and
right.
It's translated in specific concepts like you mentioned Siratul Mutasharri'in. Oh, sorry, you mentioned Siratul Uqala, but there's also Sira al Mutasharri'in, who are the people who act on law, how they are acting, and also the Urf as well, or what is common and normal. And
see, what's interesting there also is when you mention things like Urf, what's convention?
Yeah.
But for a Muslim community who are living in the southern part of Pakistan, what's conventionally sensible to do is something.
Yeah.
And what diasporic communities, Muslim communities in the West, look at convention is something else.
Yeah.
What Shia 12 of Muslims might look at what's conventionally right is something else.
Yeah.
And what, as we mentioned, the world of the dervishes, what they look at, some people might say, well, they're less concerned with law anyway.
Yeah.
When we look at Islam as a whole, we can see one original tradition, but then translated into a whole kaleidoscope of different experiences. How that tradition is lived is different for different people because of their economic circumstances, because of their sectarian backgrounds, because of their ethnic backgrounds, whatever it might be, informs even between, for example, because we are both familiar with that, that's why I'm bringing this up, a Shia 12 tradition, the way people of an ethnic Pakistani background would do that is something different. The way an Iraqi Muslim would act in Iraq is maybe different from the way he or she might behave in the UK, for example.
Yeah.
So all of these different experiences and economic background, family background, all of these things feed into it to see how they are practicing the Islam.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we have a little bit more of an insight into what sociology is about and why it is important in Islamic studies. So now I actually want to move on to the topic of our discussion, which is LGB and the Shia community. So I want to firstly ask, from all the sociological topics you could have chosen, why is this an important topic to talk about? And especially from a sociological angle, what led you to this and why is it important for us to discuss it?
Right. So the reason that I decided to look at this topic from this angle, I said there's a number of reasons, really. One is that we know when we talk about sociology in academia, over the last few decades, the sociological research into Muslim communities, especially in diasporic contexts in the Western Hemisphere, if you like, has been increasing, which is great, over the last 2 decades or so. However, when it comes to, again, because Shia Muslims are in a minority, let's say about 15% of the larger or the wider Muslim community, and that is both in the global frame, 15%, and also you can say in the Western context as well, it kind of mirrors the same proportions, so about 15%. What that means is when people, Muslims and non-Muslims, are researching Muslim communities in the West, the 15% minority often gets lumped in with the wider Muslim community, and you said Muslims are doing 1, 2, and 3, which is correct. Muslims are doing 1, 2, and 3 for XYZ reason. But when you delve deeper into the sociology of Shia Muslims, or any minority for that matter, if you say, for example, Hanbali, or those who are from this tradition, or those who are from this ethnic background, the problem we had in the UK, of course, my research, the one we're speaking about today, wasn't restricted to the UK, but you could say in the Western Hemisphere at least. But when we look at Shia Muslims, the way they were being spoken about in the UK, it was lumped with the wider Muslim community who were not only thought of as Muslims, but it was because of the waves of migration, specifically South Asian Sunni Muslims. That's what Muslims meant.
Yeah.
So Muslims and the British economy, Muslims, and it meant South Asian Muslims in Bradford, etc. This is what Muslims meant. But now, so what it was for the Shia Muslims, there was really, until maybe you can say even a decade is kind of pushing it, between growing since then exponentially, research into Shia Muslims sociologically. But there was a vacuum there. To look at, and why is that important? Why is it important to look at Shia Muslims? We know that Shia Muslims, as with any Muslim group, have a distinct theology. I'm not saying the Quran is different, but we know ideological factors or certain theological factors, and that fed into and was very evident in the research as well, as we'll talk about. They have certain ways of doing things, they have theological positions, they have experiences which are shaded and nuanced from the wider Muslim community. How do they negotiate this issue of this sensitive issue that we've been talking about? Is it different? And we will see that certainly the Shia Muslim context has certain inflections that are not, that you wouldn't be expected in the wider Muslim community. Now, in addition to that, I also have an insider position. Being of Shia Muslim background, mainstream, I don't like to use the word conservative, but from that background, the conventional Shia Muslim whose parents were not from the UK, but who migrated and who were now born and bred in the diasporic context, I'm that person. So with that background, we have, from the Orientalist side, Orientalists looking at Muslim communities. Then Muslim sociologists start looking at their own tradition. And now we have Muslim sociologists. Now we need an insider to look at our own tradition. And yeah, sure, non-Shia Muslims or non-Muslims can know about how Shia Muslims behave and how and why somehow. Like we have the research by the very fantastic researcher and scholar, the late Professor Linda Wallbridge, who looked at the Shia Muslim community in Dearborn, Michigan, and really unearthed gems in sociological research of Shia Muslims. But you and I, because we're from the same tradition, I'm saying this, we're not just aware of why Shia Muslims do certain things. We are the Shia Muslims doing certain things. Why do, for example, why do Shia Muslims from a Hawza or Pakistani background commemorate the martyrdom of Al-Abbas on the 8th of Muharram, for example? And if you get that day wrong in that community, all hell will break loose. In fact, I was told once when I went to Ottawa, now I'm not from Ottawa to an Iraqi community. I'm not from an Iraqi background. But I was told, look, these are the days that you commemorate 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. You can get them wrong. It's all up to you. It's fine if you mix them up. But on the 7th night, if you don't do Al-Abbas on the 7th night, all hell will break loose, because people have done certain vows and certain this and that. We're not just aware of these things. We are living those things. So with that insider approach, knowing that gave me that insider's view onto why certain things might happen. That gives a researcher that added benefit of knowing the community, knowing why they do things. So when they respond, you already have that empathy with them. I get where you're coming from. I understand this. I understand why you would do certain things. And it also makes participants of a research, of course, comfortable to talk to you, because they might say things in a different language, Arabic, Urdu, whatever, they would expect you to understand what they mean. And you should, if you're an insider researcher. So this led me to looking at the Shia community for this particular issue. And then why? There's the academic vacuum there. but there were also personal reasons. You know, going back in I think it was 2023, 22, especially in the UK, with the whole RSE, which was relationships and sex education in schools. This whole thing about LGBT was really blowing up post-COVID. And it started to seep into our communities and the discussions.
Yeah.
We would have to be really naive to believe that the issue affecting other religious communities is not going to or doesn't affect us.
Yeah.
Or it's not present in our community. We were not only, as Shia Muslims in the West, affected by these discussions externally. We have to recognize that this issue is present internally. And we are not going to, okay, so now we have this issue internally. Like every community does. It's not like we're an exception. Every community does, and we also do. We're not an exception, and we're not immune from it.
Yeah.
So now looking at this, to say how do we solve or how do we face this challenge that we have in the community? Well, the first thing is, are we aware of the issue first of all, or have we swept it away? Are people aware? Are psychologists aware? Are practitioners aware? Are pastoral carers aware? Are imams and sheikhs aware? I wasn't aware before I began the research. I'm sure there must be instances, but how prevalent it is hidden from the public eye for same issues of sensitivity that you've mentioned. Yeah. But it's important for us to understand what's happening in order to be able to face these challenges, why things are happening, how things are happening, who is affected. When I say a personal onus on myself as an insider Shia Muslim, invested, devoted to the Shi'i tradition, grown up with it, part of it. So like I said, I have an internal investedness here. Yeah. There are certain points or certain things which are impacting the Muslim community or the Shia Muslim community through this, which we fail to recognize. One, of course, is the obvious one, which is the issue of mental health. Now, I know you personally have worked on mental health issues from your discipline quite a bit. So you might have opened the door into the mental health issues that, again, we are not an exception that our community suffers from mental health issues. Yeah. And we are not immune. Absolutely. As every religious community is, or every community is. This issue of LGB, now we'll have to define the remit of the research, and we'll go into that a bit later. I'm not looking at the T and the Q. Yeah. L, G, and B, and of course everyone knows what those stand for, but lesbian, gay, male gay, and bisexual. People who had Shia Muslims who have those inclinations. That's what we're looking at. Now, there are certain reasons why exploring this issue is of utmost importance. One, as I said, is the mental health issue. Yeah. Zoheir, you might believe, people won't believe. Yeah. Every single, without exception, participant of the research expressed that in some point in their lives they were on the brink of suicide. Every single one. How they got through that or how they passed that phase is, if everyone has their own story. What got through them? Was it counseling? Was it this? Was it that? Some people left the religious tradition because of it, because of these things they were facing. So one is the mental health issue. And mental health issue, again, I was speaking to one lady who is prominent in the Shia Muslim community in the UK. I won't be more specific than that. And I was on the phone to her. She was saying, I'm starting to research this issue. And she already started having a go at me, got a bit defensive. Why haven't you looked at this yet? I'm just starting off on this topic. She said, personally, I know 2 young ladies in our community, and she was talking about a local context, not a particular city, a particular part of a particular city, not in the whole of the UK. Yeah. 2 young ladies who I know, she said, who have committed suicide because of this. Wow. That's in one city, one part of one city in the UK. Now, if we expand that into the UK, over the ethnicities that we have of Shia Muslims, be it Iraqi, Iranian, Hawza, Pakistani, Afghani, from the revert communities, for example, black, white,
Yeah.
and then we expand that further into Australia, Canada, USA, all of these, all the Anglophone communities, if you like.
Yeah.
We have a huge issue which we have failed to address.
Yeah.
One was mental health. Two, you can imagine stemming from that as well. So, by the way, that mental health issue, most of them, and I said all of them were suicidal at some point, was because of that conflict they felt within themselves. I'm a Shia Muslim, I'm a Muslim, this is haram. Why am I like this?
Yeah.
That internal homophobia that they had, not internal homophobia, led them to on the brink of suicide, each and every one of them. The second issue beyond that is something we also do not want. Remember, we're not legitimizing, permitting that. We're going to look at the remit of the research, was not that as well, but we're going to go into that in a moment. But how it's affecting someone who comes to their parents and says, I feel a certain way.
Yeah.
We've had numerous accounts of rupturing families.
Yeah.
Parents disowning their children. Children being alienated from their parents. Some participants I spoke to, they're not children anymore. Someone in their 20s practicing homosexuality and hiding it from their parents and feeling that they can't talk to their parents because of this issue. They can't get help with this issue because they can't talk to anyone.
Yeah.
They were talking to people outside, but then the family is broken down. Like I said, people have disowned other people. Again, another issue of domestic catastrophe, you can say, is when someone who is inclined towards homosexual tendencies, but because that's haram and they've suppressed that in themselves and they cannot be this way and they are pressured into living a conventional life that is expected of them, get married, have kids even. And now you can imagine the tensions which are within that marital relationship and within that household because someone's married. One of the, and these are insights into the research. One of the participants told me, and so someone who reads the whole article will, the paper which is going to come out of this research will get detailed insights into the experiences that these people have had. One of the participants in his mid-20s, he said he visits dating apps for homosexuals. He said, on that dating app, he said, I've seen 50, 60-year-old men from my mosque who I know, who stand in the first line of prayer and who are married and have kids. And they're on this gay dating app. If we don't address these, if these people don't have an outlet in the sense that how they can talk about what's happening to them, the challenges they're facing, they will be quashed. They will be pressured into living these lives. And then, of course, more problems arise from that as well. So that's mental health issues. We've talked about domestic issues in terms of the family. And then, can you imagine, we've spoken about these people already, even after they pass the stage of feeling suicidal or before they feel, if let's say someone never feels the phase of feeling suicidal because of this tendency they have. Can you imagine the spiritual suffering they are undergoing? How they can't bring themselves into realizing that they are feeling a certain way and Allah has prohibited this, but this is who I am. How can this, why am I being punished? Am I internally sinful? I'm evil from it. Can you imagine the spiritual? How do you explain to this person, as someone who's in pastoral care, for example, that your way to Allah is what? You don't know where to start. So again, without having these conversations, and then of course, is the impact on the wider community. So personal, familial, and now imagine how does the wider community answer these challenging questions? What kind of questions? One of the participants of the research was someone who's worked in, he's a religious personality in the UK and has worked with Shia Muslim communities for decades, literally. I've written it in the article. I've quoted him in the article saying that 30 years ago he visited a community. 30 years ago, he's thinking about 1997 or so,
Yeah.
in the West. And before he started his series of lectures, he had a Q&A with some of the ladies of the community. So the chair lady of the community, heading the ladies section, asked him a question.
Yeah.
The question was, we have 2 or 3 openly homosexual ladies in the community. 30 years ago in the Shia community, 30 years ago. Her question was, so knowing this about them and they're open about it, do we, in a gender segregated context, are they supposed to be in the ladies? Do we take off our hijab in front of, or what?
Yeah. Yeah.
If we don't have these conversations, we won't have any. And this Sheikh Sami, which is his alias I've used in the article, had really no adequate response for her. And he said even to this day, he doesn't have an adequate response for many of the questions he's asked in this respect. So all of these reasons for someone who himself, as you are, grown up with the tradition, inside a community, lived that religion and that religious experience, continue to do so. And then, for myself, in my positionality, you add to that the fact that I'm a sociologist now, trained in sociological research and have a foot in academia. Now the responsibility is unavoidable. The ethical responsibility and the onus is unavoidable now. To open this discussion, open the conversation for all of these reasons, for those who are suffering and affected by it directly, for their siblings, for their families, for the wider community. But the first thing we need, of course, is to be aware of these challenges, the prevalence of them, the realities that are being lived. That's what sociology is about, right? The lived realities. This is what it's about. The implications for the community. And then we can, of course, look at how the tradition can help people who are spiritually suffering in all of these different aspects.
Yeah, I think also from my own perspective as well, the more and more, I became a person that people would refer to for pastoral care, I started to see quite a lot more of these cases. And I think you're absolutely right in saying that, the way we have to look at what our conversation today is that we are primarily looking at the question and how the question plays out. They say in Arabic, tashkil al-mas'ala, right? It's not here to say what should be done and what shouldn't be done. That is a further conversation that should be had.
Indeed.
The phenomena itself, the sociological phenomena is something that is very important to understand, because wise action can only follow on from understanding the situation, right? And I think it's important for us to have conversations like this, even though there might be a background of fear. When we talk about these things, sometimes people might feel fearful about their own communities and things like that. But looking at it from this kind of descriptive angle, just to understand what is happening, to understand how people are reconciling between this tension that we find is very,
or
very
not
important.
reconciling in some
or
cases.
not reconciling. Yeah.
Choosing one over the other.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's how, if I'm correct here, this is how your research is also framed. It is to understand what is happening and how people are dealing with it, rather than giving a value judgment to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we'll talk more about the framing of the research itself and how it interplays with jurisprudence as well. But just to come back on, because you mentioned pastoral care. Again, one of the respondents, I'll say, to the research, who herself was not feeling those homosexual inclinations, but someone in her family was, as a result of the experiences she's gone through with her family member, she said, and her situation has become public. And I won't mention her name now, because I won't even mention her alias now, because I've forgotten what her alias was in the article itself, but people can refer to it. As a result of that, people she said from all over the world are trying to contact her, people who themselves are suffering with these inclinations and their family members, to say, my son, my daughter, my brother, sister is feeling this way. What do I do? She said, I have a WhatsApp group with hundreds of people on the WhatsApp group, Shia Muslims, on this WhatsApp group discussing these things. She said, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not someone in pastoral. I'm not a religious figure as far as Islamic knowledge is concerned. I don't know how to tackle this. Is not my responsibility.
Yeah.
But they're referring to her for help.
Yeah.
Why? They have nowhere else to go. No one else knows how to deal with it. No one else knows the phenomena. No one else recognizes it. The regular imam, sheikh is going to tell you, this is haram, don't do it.
Yeah.
Beyond that, that's not very helpful for someone who's, in that situation.
Yeah.
200 people in that one WhatsApp group or more. And she said, this is not my responsibility.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I just want to push back a little bit, on the question of dealing with, understanding the LGB community. I mean, is there not a direct conflict between Muslimness and, these groups like LGB or these, feelings? Is it not supposed to happen that they have mental issues and mental problems because at the end of the day they're committing sins? Why should we be concerned with this community at all? And why should we be concerned to understand what they're going through? Should we not just stick to the jurisprudential view that this is not allowed and just stick with that? Why should we deal with it in any nuanced way at all?
When we look at this research itself, which we spoke about sociology in the first place and what it is and how certain or how the tradition of Islam is enacted or applied in daily life, in order to understand this particular research, not only defining what it is, or what it was, we can also define it by its remit, looking at what this research isn't or wasn't whilst it was happening. It is not, and it was not, a critical engagement with the jurisprudential tradition.
Yeah.
If someone wants to carry out such a research, up to them. As a sociologist, this was not part of the research. It was not an engagement with the theology.
Yeah.
It was not a research that was concerned with making moral or ethical judgments either way.
Yeah.
This is right or wrong, or that is right or wrong.
Yeah.
It was least bit concerned with that. And of course, when I was interviewing the participants, you can imagine they were skeptical of being researched. And it's the first thing I had to really spend a good 10 to 12 minutes before getting into discussion, that this is not what the research is trying to talk about.
Yeah.
It's not what the research is about. You would use the word sin. Sin is a loaded term. Are they not sinning then? Is this not a sin? Is that what I'm saying? Well, my article, which when it comes out, the tentative title I put on it, on the top of it, was dealing with dichotomy. So actually I positioned it as a dichotomy. It is dichotomous. And why I'll explain in just a moment. So even in the article, I kept saying, this is what it's about. It's not jurisprudential. It's not a moral judgment. It's not ethically framing X, Y, and Z actions or performances. And the first editors came back to me saying, you've overstated this numerous times. In the article, we get the point, So, I mean, that's how concerned I was about framing what this research actually is. It's none of that. That being said, jurisprudence, fiqh, is discussed heavily in the article as laying a foundation to say this is a dichotomy between the not Muslims. Again, it's a very Shi'i-oriented research. So although the same things might apply to the wider Muslim community, fine, but to their Shia Muslimness and their homosexuality.
Yeah.
So that dichotomy, which in the article, that the whole research is foregrounded on that reality as fact, that there is a dichotomy. And why did I do that? Because I looked, and in the backdrop of it was looking at the Shi'i lived tradition as being heavily, more than other Muslims. So when you talk about why Shia specifically, because Shia Muslims have certain idiosyncrasies that other Muslims wouldn't have. And this is one of them. The Shi'i lived tradition, and I brought the literature to prove this point, is heavily lived through jurisprudence,
Yeah.
do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
Conformity with jurisprudence gives a person, in a personal level, religiosity.
Yeah.
So jurisprudence, as opposed to, for example, virtue ethics and these kind of things, jurisprudence has a monopoly on the communal Shi'i psyche. Shia Muslims live their life, as I said, on the bounds of do's and don'ts. Conformity with jurisprudence gives that person their own religiosity.
Yeah.
Furthermore, outside of that, on a communal level, conformity with jurisprudence and awareness, mastery of jurisprudence gives the person religious currency, station, acceptance. So Shi'ism, in contrast to, and especially the segments in the Western Hemisphere that I was referring to, I say Western Hemisphere more, I emphasize this more, because there is also research which I quoted showing that not only in a religious sense, diasporic cultures cling to aspects of their identity markers more strongly than non-diasporic individuals who are back home, as it were. So, for example, we give the analogy of people who have migrated to the UK from a Caribbean background. When they first came, the early generations would cling on to reggae music, for example, and certain aspects that define their culture even more strongly than people in Jamaica would perhaps. Because in an alien environment, they were trying to preserve that culture. In a religious context, the same thing happens with Muslims, and now with Shia Muslims, as jurisprudential conformity, as we said, is an identity marker. So clinging onto that becomes stronger in a diasporic context. So for this segment of people, their religion, their Shi'ism is lived through jurisprudential harmony. What does the classical jurisprudence say? So the article isn't concerned with engaging the jurisprudential tradition, but stating it as fact. And therefore, that dichotomy is existing. The Shi'i jurisprudence, as you're very well aware of, when it comes to this topic, unlike other topics we know in, for example, fiqh al-istidlali, things that are hashed out, this hadith says this, that hadith says that, so this one counted this, and we go back and forth, until we say this is X, and the ruling about this is mustahab or haram or halal or whatever it might. For this topic, no. There is no discussion. Absent in all the fiqh tradition, all the usuli tradition. The only place in jurisprudence we find this topic being discussed is when it comes to hudud, discussing corporal or capital punishment, who should be killed and how, who should be lashed and how. There are even punishments for example, I'm quoting, and I've quoted in the article, for example, the late Ayatollah Muntazari, Sheikh Mudaffar. So fairly contemporary scholars. And of course, they're depending on the classical tradition when they quote this in their works. A woman who is unclad, lying with another woman under one blanket. What is the corporal punishment that should be enacted in this case? If it's men, then what? If this is that, if they go to this extent, all the way up to, you can say, going to the extent of the whole homosexual act. In suhq, you can see for lesbianism, and they call it mithali now, but adolescent, if it's an adolescent, then what? If this was the only place in jurisprudence, in Shi'i jurisprudence, is discussed is when it comes to punishment. One, or stemming on from that, or ensuing from that, you can say all of those things which require or which warrant hudud punishments in the classical tradition are also all of those. There are those things which warrant punishment in the afterlife with hellfire and eternity in the hellfire, or known as the kaba'ir, the major misdeeds or the major sins. There are also those which are kaba'ir and warrant the hudud punishments, are also those which degrade a person or relegate a person
Yeah.
from the status of being adil. And again, that carries its own implications. Who can lead prayer? An adil. You see the crescent of the new moon. Who can you depend on? Adil. Adil meaning upright, morally upright. So this act relegates a person, or not only the consummation of the act, but any degree of that act, the discussion of it relegating a person from that. So this is where it's discussed in jurisprudence, in Shi'i jurisprudence, one. And two, to go further in the Shi'i jurisprudence, again, I'm not making a judgment. I'm stating what the fact is. In the Shi'i jurisprudence, homosexuality and performing it is seen as so obviously impermissible that contesting its impermissibility takes a person outside the fold of Islam because it's tantamount to rejecting the scripture. It's so clear that someone who denies its hurma, its impermissibility, cannot be within the fold of Islam, cannot be classed as a Muslim. When you look at that degree, the jurisprudence is clear. There is no ambiguity there. Even although in the non-Shi'i context, so my research is Shi'i focused. In the non-Shi'i context, there are fringe voices looking at how to negotiate the jurisprudence. Within the Shi'i context, we don't have it at all. One, the jurisprudence is clear. Two, I framed Shi'i lived tradition as being experienced through jurisprudential conformity as a form of identity. And then I've said, for that matter, we can see there is a dichotomy. How these individuals are dealing then with that dichotomy is what I'm looking at. So it's not looking at whether someone sinned or not. It's not looking at why can't we just damn them to hell. I'm not saying hellfire or damn, or those are all value judgments, which is not part of my research at all. Remember, why can we not say, oh, forget it, well, who cares what they're suffering from, they're doing this act. It's a good question, and a question that I may have asked myself years ago, because I've been on this journey, looking at people as people. One of the respondents, one of the female participant, who has since undergoing this journey or these experiences, has lost many of her family, relationship with her parents, of course, interaction with her local community. She was at one point, she told me, standing on the banks of the Thames years ago, before she passed that phase of her life, with that internal homophobia of, should I just end it now? Because this is internally conflicted. She said to me during the interview, when I was asking the similar kind of questions you're alluding to, something that stopped me in my tracks. She said, I'm going to ask you a question. I said, yeah. After losing 1, 2, 3, 4, her whole life, having grown up as a Shia Muslim in the UK, she said, if now I could press a button at this point, which would reverse everything for me not to be like this, don't you think I would press it now? When we say sin, there's that we acting as if a person's, chosen to go out of their way. We haven't understood why. Another participant, his name alias Vasim, from somewhere in Europe, again, was on the brink of suicide. Still, ardent Shia Muslim, wanted to give this up, unable. In the interview, he's telling me, I don't want to do this. I'm unable to give this up. He can't seek the help because pastoral workers don't know how to work with this. And that brings us on to, why can't he seek help outside the community? We live in a Western world where conflicts with our religious principles, which would tell a person that this is okay, where this person is saying for himself or herself, I don't feel this is okay. So again, when carrying out this research, this was one of the main challenges. I had to really tightrope. On one hand, you're looking at political pressures, which is saying, you even saying something is dichotomous is homophobia anyway. So there's a political pressure there. On the other hand, saying the opening these conversations, you are normalizing the conversations around this very sinful thing. Why are you doing that?
Yeah.
You're trying to destroy Islam from within.
Yeah.
So you can neither turn here nor there. And in the middle, families and individuals are committing suicide and families are falling apart. So yeah, when you ask this question as to why can't we just leave it as it is, people are suffering.
Yeah.
You want to call them sinful? Okay. You don't want to call them sinful? Okay. None of my business. As far I haven't got a jurist's hat on as far as this research is concerned. What my personal convictions are, and this again turns to positionality when it comes to research, what my personal convictions are irrelevant. Are they going to play a role in the way I carry out this research? That's unavoidable. Complete objectivity in any sociological research is for the birds. We have to see where am I positioned. So I mentioned, for example, that I am an insider as far as the Shia community is concerned, and that gives me proximity to the participants. At the same time, I'm a heterosexual, heteronormative Shia, someone who's brought up as a very traditional, conventional, conservative Shia Muslim, if you like. At the same time, I'm an academic researcher. And these people are not academic researchers. That in itself gives me an outsidership. I'm an insider and I'm an outsider. I'm an insider in some sense that allows me access to this research. I'm an outsider that allows me some sort of objective distance from the research in order to be able to carry it out. And so on this note, Professor Kim Knott has written a fantastic work for those who are interested in sociology about the continuum, the insider-outsider continuum. No one can really say... so I mentioned late Professor Linda Wallbridge, who carried out sociological work, ethnographic work on the Shia Muslim community in Dearborn, Michigan. So compared to her, I'm an insider. She's a white... it was a Lebanese community. She's a white, non-Lebanese, non-Shia background, non-Muslim, going in to research an alien community. Whereas me, I've been born and raised as a Shia Muslim. When I ask questions to female participants, they might not open up to me as they open up to her. When it comes to sensitive issues about fiqh, about menstruation, about childbirth, about this, and they might, childbirth was difficult for me because blood loss was X, Y. They might not say that to me. She has more insidership than I do in some respects. So we have a continuum here. So I'm somewhere on that insider-outsider continuum when it comes to that this particular research. We cannot leave these people. But I don't have a jurist hat on now. Whatever my own convictions are jurisprudentially, park to one side. I want to know what's going on. Then how to address this from a jurisprudential lens. I might pass on that baton to someone who does want to wear that jurisprudential hat, and they can carry on and see how we can face these challenges.
So I think what you've expressed here is that there is definitely a lived dichotomy. Right?
Indeed.
Stemming from the jurisprudential tradition, which is quite unanimous and almost straightforward on the issue, such that even if it's questioned, it's considered something to be outside of the mainstream or challenging one of the essential aspects of religion. And
that's what holding or endorsing its impermissibility. You mentioned that the essential aspects of religion. So we mentioned later Ayatollah Muntaziri actually mentioned it as min daruriyat ad-din. It's from the essential aspects of the religion to endorse its impermissibility. And if you don't, or if you question it, takes you outside the fold of Islam.
So it's pretty intense. From that, and that maybe that is also the reason why Muslim communities can sometimes be very uncomfortable with the conversation at all. And so in that light, why is it important to look at this from the academic lens rather than from perhaps a jurisprudential lens? So my first question here was, why don't we look at it through jurisprudence? The second question here is, why are we looking at it from another perspective?
So I suppose looking at jurisprudentially, already we've made a value judgment. And that turns off any participation. Now you don't know, even through this, knowing that I'm a heterosexual, heteronormative individual who's come from a Shia conservative background, this sensitive topic, you can just imagine how reluctant participate. They weren't queuing up to participate in this research. You can imagine how reluctant they must have been to talk about this particular issue. And it's something that, of course, is so close to them that, as I mentioned, all of them had mentioned that at some point in their life they were suicidal. So a deep personal issue, which people, even it was some of these people, by the way, they were not outed in that their homosexuality. Only a few people knew about it. Their own families didn't know about it. Alienated from everyone who knows about them. Going to be pushed out. They're clinging on to whatever familiarity they have left in terms of their family, their parents, their community. One person, again, his alias was Aqil, mentioned that he goes to the Muslim to the center, Shia center, his local Shia center, to feel part of that community. Remember, again, when we talk about lived Islam, lived Shi'ism, it's not scripture. It's how scripture has formed this community. It's family ties. It's community ties. It's communal rites and rituals. It's the Thursday night dua kumail. It's the Muharram lectures that you go to. Is eating iftar together in lines. He said, every time I go there, I know what I am inside, he was saying. Now, whether that's something which is intrinsic, whether it's natural, whether it's nature or nurture, again, not part of my research. He was feeling like that as his identity, as his essence, as his very being. He was inclined that way. So every time I go there, I know all of these people around me and my friends, some of them who he grew up with in Sunday school and the mosque and sports. And he was, that was his community. Talking about homosexuality and homosexuals in a very derogative, they're talking about me, he said. And he was hidden behind that wall. He said, he mentioned the name of some scholars who ascended the pulpit and spoke about it in a very judgmental way. He said, they're talking about me. So you can imagine what the situation of this person who's feeling internally in a certain way, can't express it, alienated from everything. We cannot unearth the realities of what people are going through in themselves, how their families are affected, and how the wider community can help or is affected themselves when we put that jurisprudential cap on and say, you know, this is haram, this is halal. This is, if you do this, you're outside. If you believe that this is what, you're outside the fold of Islam. How are you gonna deal with the topic in this way? I myself, one of the challenges was, of course, tightroping this between the political pressures, the religious pressures. One challenge I mentioned already was the participants' reluctance to participate. So what I did was, there are a couple of people, having grown up as a Shia Muslim, we know of one or two cases you can tap into that, you know, and then say, you know what, if you're carrying out this research, if you're making our voices heard, so despite the fact that the participants were not lining up, queuing outside my door to participate in this research, obviously, the ones who did participate said the sentiment they had is that through this research, we want to see it come out. Why? Because we want people to know we exist. We are suffering. We are here. We are Shia, and we feel this way. We are, do something or help us, but help us. Even one of them said, help us or revile us, kick us to the curb, whatever. But we do exist. That's one thing. The second thing is, I said, thank you for talking about it. But through that whole journey of talking to people, I've come through a journey as looking at people as people. If I see a drunkard, is it a sin? Okay, I may believe it's a sin, but that's still an individual who, because of certain circumstances in his or her life, has gone a certain way. Which of us, Zoheir, are free from sin anyway to cast judgment? Our sin might sin, again, because my research is not to do with that judgment, but our sin may not be homosexuality, may be something else. And if people knew about it and if they put the jurisprudential cap on, they would not shake our hands. I had to put that part of myself aside, look at people, as human beings, as myself. See what they are going through, hearing their accounts. And one, again, because I've come through this journey, actually one childhood friend of mine, he said, you know, I think you would change your stance slightly. I said, why? If you ever spoke to them on homosexuality, we're talking about. So what do you mean? Like, it's haram. That's not what I'm talking about. You would change your stance if you ever engage with them. This was years ago. I've come on a journey. We see people as a sin or as a good deed, as a as piety or as sinfulness, as virtue or vice. These are human beings. So I've come through that. And then as a result of that, another challenge of carrying out the research or getting the respondents or participants, which, by the way, happens like I tapped into one or two people. And they would say, by the way, if you're carrying out this research, I know someone who I know would like to, but their parents don't know. I know someone who is suffering, but their family doesn't know. Their friends don't know. If I give them your contact details, could you? So this is called in sociological research purposive sampling and snowball sampling. So purposive sampling, I pick out one or two people I know. And from that is snowballs. So my sample was by snowball sampling and I got a pool of participants. But in hearing their accounts and having gone through that journey of looking at people as people, I used to come away from the interview or these interviews that I'm carrying out, and then some colleagues asked me, you okay? I just need a couple, I just need to unwind. Because it's traumatic for me, distressing for me to hear the very deep accounts of suffering that human beings have undergone because they're now dealing with a dichotomy within themselves. How they negotiated that, how they come through that, what and how the tradition of Islam is playing out in lived lives. It was difficult at some points.
And humbling as well, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to the meat of your findings. How is it that this dichotomy is negotiated or not negotiated?
That's really, as you said, that's the juice, if you like, of the research. What came out, and in the findings, which I'll go into in just a moment, I divided. Using illustrations here, I divided my findings into 3 Ds. 1 D, which was not able to reconcile between the two, was disavowing their Shi'ism. The second D, again, not able to reconcile, was dissociating from their own homosexuality. And the last D was denying the dichotomy. All of my participants, of course, as you know, were Shia Muslims. And why is that important? As you mentioned earlier on, that every faith community or non-faith community, every segment of people, culturally defined, ethnically defined, religiously defined, is going to have their own inflections in how certain things are applied and carried out in their circumstances. The same set of circumstances faced by a different ethnic community, a different faith community, is going to react in a different way. These were Shia Muslims. And of course, they had particularities in how they responded. They had certain theologies. For example, I mentioned Wasim, I think already, as his alias. He felt ashamed of performing that action. And why did he feel ashamed? What was for him? Of course, he might have felt ashamed because he might have had a background or an upbringing that taught him this is wrong anyway, with that conditioning. But how did he translate that conditioning in how he was feeling ashamed now at 40 years old? He said, he was trembling in the interview. So this was, again, something can be distressing. He said, I feel ashamed that every time I commit this deed, the Imam knows of my deed and the ilm al-ghayb of the Ahlul Bayt, and how must they be viewing me? So you can see the response of this individual is very Shi'ified, if you like. So that's why it's important to look at each community and see how they respond. Why? Because if you want to face a challenge, I'm not talking about it in a jurisprudential way or theological way. There is a challenge going on. There is something, a reality. How to face it, we need to know how these people are experiencing it, what language they are using. So this individual was ashamed of his deed, of his performance, because he said the Imam is receiving my deeds, is aware of, and they're looking at me through the ilm al-ghayb, and how must they be feeling whilst I'm committing this deed?
Yeah.
For example, another individual tried to align or reinterpret. He made attempts to reinterpret the scripture through a Shi'i lens.
Yeah.
To say why things might not be impermissible. But that was, by the way, someone who had experience and learning in a Shi'i seminary.
Okay.
So he was bringing out that language, that jurisprudential vernacular he was aware of. And he tried to engage with it in that way, Shi'i usul.
It's kind of critiquing the mainstream view.
Right. But he had some tools, also basic tools, tools to try and engage with the hermeneutics.
Yeah.
The third one, which I think in the article I've written a whole section about because it was Shia Muslims, because of the ubiquitousness of Imam Hussein's icon, alayhi salam, and the episode of Karbala, how far that is interwoven with Shi'ism. People, some of the participants were turning to that. And I'll explain why as we talk about the findings. So the first segment of people were those who were disavowing the Shi'ism and said, they were no longer practicing, they don't pray anymore. I'm culturally Shia, for example, because my family is Shia. I was brought up in this, theologically distanced from what they had been brought up with. This Aqil, for example, he was one of these people. Went to Sunday school, grew up. He said he won Quran competitions.
Wow.
And he had top grades in all of his exams in the Sunday school and whatever. So he was part and parcel of that, and now distancing himself from that entire tradition because of his the theological dichotomy he was facing and the jurisprudential issues he couldn't take that dichotomy, and he said he was more inclined now towards Rumi and his personal relationship with God, and distance himself with the formal Shi'i creed.
Yeah,
so he exemplified the first category.
So while disassociating, he still remained within the fold of some sort of Muslim practice, some sort of religion of Islam.
So he was disavowing with his Shi'ism particularly.
Yeah.
And even that, he said, every now and again, he still visits the Shia Islamic Center because his family does, and he has friends there, although he himself doesn't personally, in himself, identify as a Shia Muslim. Culturally, he is there. So here we see, as a lived tradition, again, Shi'ism interwoven with culture. Culturally, ethnically, linguistically, culinarily, if that's a word, he's still part of this community.
Yeah.
But within himself, he said, I'm not a Shia Muslim anymore.
He found a manifestation of Islam that would not have that dichotomy anymore.
Yeah, so about him, I commented that the manifestation of Islam, so he still hung on, can you see, he's still hanging on to his Muslimness, if not his Shia-ness.
Yeah.
He found a Muslim tradition, which, as you know, is not heavily emphasizing jurisprudence. So again, that reinstates and re-emphasizes my first assertion that Shi'ism is lived through jurisprudence heavily as an identity mark. Whereas when he was now engaging with groups, Sufi groups, not so concerned with jurisprudence. So he could hang on to his Muslim identity, if not his Shia identity, because he found a channel of Muslimness which doesn't heavily focus on jurisprudence. So he went that way. So he was one of the first category. The second category, those who were Wasim, who I mentioned about Ilm al-Ghayb of the Imams, trying but failing. And he said to me, I'm trying but failing to disassociate with his homosexuality. And of course, when we talk about jurisprudence, of course, and we're not engaging with the jurisprudence as far as my research was concerned, a homosexual inclination, tendency, attraction is not what's jurisprudentially impermissible.
It's not within the remit, actually, of
absolutely. Of course, jurisprudence looks at outward action. And that's where the jurisprudence says it's impermissible. So he still had this inclination. He couldn't get rid of that. But beyond that, moreover, he couldn't rid himself of the practice. But he said, I'm trying my best. So he was one of those who was trying to hang on to his Shi'ism through these his theology and what have you. Another example was one individual who was staunch that he said, I don't want to be categorized as gay or homosexual. He said, because this is an identity. I don't identify as homosexual. I'm not. I said, well, then I have or had same-sex attraction. That's what I suffered with. I'm not a homosexual. He didn't want to identify. So he's clinging on to his Shi'ism, believing this is the right religion. Interestingly, with him, he underwent what is denounced in this country. So again, I'm walking that tightrope. He underwent conversion therapy to reorient himself. Again, I'm not making value judgments. Is that right, wrong? Not in my remit of my research. But he underwent this experience to try and reorient himself towards heterosexuality. So again, this is wrong. He disavowed or disassociated with homosexuality and he clung on to as a sin. And he held on. But having gone through that experience himself, was very sympathetic to people who were homosexual Muslims, saying they're suffering like I was suffering, he said. So he had that experience. And then the last category were, this is how I split them into three, were those people who tried to deny that dichotomy and and you can imagine it's something that they would really have an impetus towards doing, because it's themselves, they're conflicted within themselves, how difficult that must be, and try and bring those two together. One of them, as I mentioned already, was the individual who had some Hawza experience and some traditional learning, and he tried to engage with the jurisprudence and the usuli tradition to see how he could, blur those very sharp edges we've spoken about. In the end, mind you, he said, with the traditional and established and existing usuli framework we have, there's no way you can do it. There's no way. He said to himself, I have to step outside of that in order to try and justify these things. So he tried to deny that it can happen this way. Funnily enough, one of the family members who I've already mentioned her, who very close relative is a homosexual or is gay, she was saying, Shi'ism, we Shia Muslims are so progressive and so in the intellectual tradition so far ahead than other Muslim traditions. So she can see how far she's clinging on to this, that I'm sure it's just a matter. Our laws have changed over 12 centuries. I'm sure it's just a matter of time until we find the right answer. So she herself was not suffering from that, but her family member who she was, empathetic with, and of course a very close family member. So she was trying to align the two. Shi'i tradition is such that it's forward-thinking, again, progressive, all of these words, forward-thinking, progressive, It's just a matter of time until we find the right answer. She's still a Shia Muslim. And another set of people who were looking at their LGB identity as a minority issue, which they're in the minority, and the discrimination these people face as a minority, and then looking at the social justice angle. Did Imam Hussein alayhi salam not stand up for those who were downtrodden, to those who were... Did he not stand up for social justice? Wasn't his movement not a social justice movement? And they really clung on to the icon of Imam Hussein alayhi salam as an avenue. One thing one identity marker which we've discussed, which was the backdrop of my article, was fact that Shi'ism is practiced through jurisprudence or performed through jurisprudence. The other one is Karbala, Ashura, and Imam Hussein. So if X person could not find or found that this avenue of expressing or identifying with his or her Shi'ism is closed, they overemphasized the other one through the narrative of social justice. And that came up more than twice or thrice. A number of times in the research, different participants were looking at Imam Hussein as a champion of social justice, say this is wrong, we have to right this wrong.
So these are the ways that they kind of tried to balance moving away from the jurisprudence and trying to get to, the icon of Imam Hussein. I mean, I guess if you're still looking at this through a jurisprudential lens, of those three groups, perhaps only group 2 would be the acceptable one. Because group 1 is moving away from Shi'ism.
Yeah.
And group 2 is doing the exact thing that we said, trying to justify something that is considered for at least some of the fuqaha of the dururiyat ad-din.
Yeah.
So that
most
would
of them.
be,
I mean, that's
So that would be. So it's very difficult to negotiate a space for this with the recognition of the dilemma of the human suffering and mental problems and the people who are involved. And I think the recognition that some individuals, from a belief perspective, fully invested in Shi'ism, they believe in Allah, Quran, Holy Prophet, Imams, Day of Judgment.
Remember, the last category who are trying to align the two aspects of the dichotomy are also still, the reason they're trying to bring the two together is because they're still fully aligned with Allah, Prophet, Quran, and all of these things, and don't want to let go of that aspect of their identity.
Yeah, but the tension is there, right? That
absolutely.
Are you really, if you like, from a judgment from the outside, are you really believing in them if you're not practicing what they have asked you to practice? But then the counter to that is, well, there's something very different when it comes to, if you like, voluntary practice, so praying and fasting and those things, and something that seems to be a little more challenging than that, beyond what would usually be expected for a Muslim to deal with. There's a lot of jurisprudence that actually intersects at this point as well. Bearing this in mind, we've looked at the human suffering. We've looked at the way people, are trying to balance things. If I'm going to come, and I'm asking you this from, a certain perspective, just because I feel perhaps this is a prevalent perspective within the community, which is that, if I put myself as a community member and I see somebody, perhaps going through, this suffering, so that suffering doesn't sit well with me. I'm also a human being. I see someone who's going through difficulty. But at the same time, I have my beliefs and I have my jurisprudential tradition, which is my way of identifying with religion. I understand religion through that lens. If I look at this situation, what should I do? On the one hand, I might feel like I have a duty of amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. So if I was to accept certain practices or certain people that have claimed they have certain practices or claim that they are a certain way, I might feel that I'm not being faithful to that duty. And on the other hand as well, I might feel like you said before, you have to be careful not to be perceived almost as allowing something that would be considered sinful to spread, right? So how should a person, and I'm asking for your opinion here, this, of course, I'm sure there's no straight answer to this, but how should a person go about negotiating these difficulties, and what should they do?
So, I mean, we know when it comes to Amr al-Ma'ruf, has its own conditions.
Yeah.
If by trying to do this Amr al-Ma'ruf, a person is going to cause more harm than bring a person to betterment, that's a problem in itself. And these issues, as we've mentioned already, are so deep-lying, so complex, that someone who doesn't understand them, and most of us don't understand them, someone who doesn't have insight into psychology and mental health, how these things work, well, the common sense advice, for even if they are a religious scholar in a pastoral position, not just your average community elder. If without laying value on sinfulness or not sinful, I can say for a fact that if someone doesn't have training as a psychologist and in mental health issues, they cannot deal with this problem. They cannot. Their understanding won't be there. You and I, Zoheir, have tread the academic path as well as gone down the Hawza path. Put those two together, I haven't had the exposure to mental health training that you might have had. I'm not in a position to deal with these issues. So if by doing Amr al-Ma'ruf is going to cause more harm than good, which unavoidably it will if you don't have that training. Can you imagine, the person, according to the tradition, what they said wasn't right. For example, the story we've heard about, someone who had late teenagers, one committed suicide, and the Muslim came to for some, comfort
Yeah.
to the person in their mosque who was in charge of the pastoral care and said, what's the situation of my friend in the hereafter committed suicide? The person quoted a hadith, that person's damned till the hellfire. This is not the response that they were looking for. It could worsen things.
Yeah.
So if a person, again, is not trained in those mental health issues, best to avoid it, or better still, to convey that message to or convey that person to someone who is trained to deal with these issues. Most people are not. I'm not,
Yeah.
to be very frank. I've had insight into this side, that side. I'm not trained to deal with them. And when we talk about a conflict, a person might feel conflicted within themselves.
Yeah.
What's the conflict? The person, when they're approached with this issue, is not allowing, if they believe it to be a sin, or whoever believes it to be a sin, allowing it to spread. But this person deserves which religious tradition says that for this reason, if suicide takes place, that's a good outcome? Did the Prophet act in this way? The Imams that we hold to be so, did any of them act in such a way? In fact, we know that we do have in that hadith, for example, for sexual crimes, that people came to the Holy Prophet and Imam Ali alayhi salam to confess their crimes, and they were first turned away. This was the spirit that they had, rather than suffering is good for them because they're committing sin. This is not the way. We would have that. We will have that reaction to all backbiting, drinking, lying, homosexuality. If all of these we class them as sins as far as the jurisprudence is concerned. If we don't look at people as human beings, and that's the first thing. We need to humanize people as opposed to looking at people as good deeds and bad deeds. So it's an interesting question that you've asked, because one research we've carried out so far, as far as the Shia community is concerned, is how are these individuals who are affected by this directly negotiating this dichotomy? And when the community has to deal with it, people in pastoral positions, imams, the resident alim of any community, alima of any community, or those people in those kind of positions, chaplains, the conflict you're talking about, it's a spiritual conflict for them now. Normalization or tolerance towards what I believe is a sin. And on the other hand, I've got someone's mental health at stake and possible very severe ramifications of that. That's another area of research which we'll be hoping to go into in the future. How do people in pastoral positions, practitioners, negotiate this predicament itself?
That's a very interesting area. Because it is part of, we're looking at lived tradition. This is also the kind of lived experience of how to deal with these issues from a pastoral perspective.
Who cares for the carers?
Exactly. So I'm going to ask you one more question as well, into the kind of, if you like, from the community perspective, which is that, do you feel, or how would you respond to somebody who says that we're only becoming more open to talking about these things because of a lobby, because, if you like, traditional Muslim values are being eroded, and that's why we're even opening a conversation about this at all? I mean, what would your ideas be on that?
I think that's a fair criticism, to be very frank.
Yeah.
This whole research, I told you, one of the starting points of it was the fact that post-COVID, 2022, 23, the Pride movement had a huge social media impact, had a huge social impact, political impact, organizations like Stonewall. And on the counter of it, by the way, we had Muslim organizations. We had, if you recall, in Birmingham, Muslims protesting outside schools against RSE, relationship and sex education. Of course, that was more than just talking about homosexuality, but their main concern was that homosexuality was being normalized. That was what they. So for someone to say we're only talking about this now because of what we're faced with around, I think that's true. Yeah, that's true.
It's part of the contextual factors that
absolutely
feed into lived religion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That being said, from our literature, we know that this issue isn't something we're talking about it now openly.
Yeah.
because we have a challenge to deal with. If we don't, we're going to drive into this brick wall. It's a ticking time bomb that we want to brush under the carpet continuously. People are suffering, families are broken, people are committing suicide. But the issue of homosexuality within Muslim societies is not a new one. And our literature is filled with instances of homosexuality, yes, of non-heteronormativity. People, hermaphrodites, for example, how did the imams deal with this issue? We know that within the mainstream society in Iran, for example, numerous people have undergone sex changes, which is jurisprudentially sanctioned. And I say that also feeds into, because that's why when it comes to this whole one lumped together identity of LGBTQI+, my research, its ambit was LGBY, because the T part of it might not face that jurisprudential dichotomy, but the LGB did.
Definitely does.
So that's why I limited it to this. Of course, it can be expanded if people want to explore how other people are experiencing these things. But I've lost the question. What was actually
the initial question was talking about, are we not influenced to carry out these
Right,
things?
we are influenced. We are influenced. But is that a bad thing? If we are influenced to talk, we were facing a problem which we didn't want to talk about. Now, outside circumstances is forcing us, because of what our kids are facing, being taught, being exposed to. I know when us growing up in this country, born and raised in London, growing up and being educated within that, I wasn't exposed to the kind of stuff my kids are being exposed to in terms of these topics. But it's within our community. We've hidden it. We've shied away from it. How is the outside influence forcing us to deal with it open? Yeah, it is. It is. But is that a bad thing? That's what I would ask. Is that a bad thing? Or is it worse not to talk about it and let people die, let families be ruptured, let people who need help, have nowhere to turn to, let them leave the religion because they couldn't get this explained to them. There was a theological conflict, a jurisprudential conflict. Let them go. Let other people resort to conversion therapy. Is that the right answer? Well, we haven't explored it. We don't talk about it. So yes, we have been influenced by the outside to talk about these things, but is that a bad thing in itself? Knowing that internally we do have an issue that we don't speak about.
Yeah, okay. I think that's very insightful. And I think the whole conversation that we've had has been very insightful and definitely a good starting point for a lot more deeper conversations, just like the research itself is a starting point for more research to kind of pad out the field. Is there any specific areas that you think are good for further research?
So, as I mentioned, as far as the sociology is concerned, I've looked at the people who are themselves directly suffering as Shia Muslims. And one thing I mentioned would be interesting to look at how practitioners of religion are negotiating this conflict within themselves. Their clients on one hand and their religious affiliations on the other hand and commitments on the other hand. But beyond the sociological discipline, I mentioned one of the participants who's tried to look at jurisprudence and try. Right now, the jurisprudential wall is closed. Okay, is that going to remain as such? Are the lived experiences of people going to inform jurisprudence? What about theology? The whole idea of, did Allah create people in this way? Is it nurture? Is it nature? I mean, we've dealt with it from we are dealing with it. We are starting to deal with it. We don't deal with it. We are starting to deal with it from one discipline, which I think is a good starting point to open the conversation, because we're talking about what's there, not what should be and what shouldn't be. What Allah is, no, what's there, this is there. For that to permeate then into other disciplines of Islamic studies, researching areas of this, it can only lead to further growth. If the conclusion of people's research is, it is, this the status quo is the correct way, good, okay. If there's other research, good. It's just a growth of knowledge, but we need, because we spoke about the dynamic between scripture, between religion, between tradition and the lived experience, that dynamic is going to continue whether we like it or not. We might as well be part of that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. It's better to be part of that conversation than to ignore it. Okay, so my final question for you, as is the tradition on the Thinking Islam podcast, is to ask you if there are any questions that you currently have in mind, anything that you're looking into, what are the kind of questions that you personally are grappling with at the moment?
So I think I mentioned already
Yeah.
that what we're moving on to now is to look at these individuals who are suffering. We've said they're suffering, we've said their families are suffering.
Yeah.
And you asked me the question, someone in the community who has religious investedness, commitment, and sees this as a sin. If a person in a position of pastoral care, we would hope they have the skills of dealing with mental health issues, knows that their client is in a very difficult position when it comes to mental health. It could be self-harm, could be up to suicide, as we've mentioned a number of times. That's happened. It's not something hypothetical. It's happened. So when they dealt with it, how do they resolve that conflict? How do they go about it? Are they pulled one way or the other? Saving of someone's life, the betterment of their... We know also from studies have shown us that people who can reconcile their conflicts with their religion and hold on to a religious identity, it's better for their mental health. So now this person in a pastoral care position also has a duty here from a religious perspective and from a mental health perspective, pointing the same way. But then how do they resolve how this person is feeling? Are they going to say it's forbidden? How do they wean them? What's their answer? What's their response? Especially because this issue, as opposed to other sins like backbiting, it seems for you and I who are heterosexual, normal, what's normal anyway? But let's say heteronormative people. If someone asked us not to be heterosexual,
that would be quite challenging.
So this is a challenge that people are faced with on the other side of the scale. How is someone in that position, a practitioner, going to align these two, their client and their religion?
Very, very, very insightful and deep. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope the viewers have enjoyed
I hope so.
our discussion.